Hello, I am George Hitchens. It is Monday, August 5th, 2024, and I am at the Gettysburg National Military Parks Visitor Center, and my guest is Park Ranger John Hoptak. Thank you, John, for taking time out of your day for this interview.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with you, George.
Great. First question, what is your background and how long have you worked at the Gettysburg National Military Park?
Well, my background is history. I went to school for history. I have a bachelor's degree in history from Kutztown University here in Pennsylvania. I have a master's from Lehigh University, and I also have a teaching certification in Pennsylvania. So I've always been history, just a fascination with the Civil War era. And I have been with the National Park Service since 2006, but at Gettysburg since 2012. So 12 years here at Gettysburg.
Wow, that's awesome. So you would definitely be an expert in Battle of Gettysburg. Uh, um, question number two, what has been done in the last few months or years to return the battlefield, more or less Little Round Top, to the state it was in July of 1863?
Sure. Well, our mission here at the National Park Service is not only to educate, but also preserve, interpret, and rehabilitate the landscape as best we can to the way it appeared at the time of the battle. And sometimes it's tricky because we have to walk that balancing line between preservation and accessibility, making it accessible. And
Right.
Little Round Top, especially, is a key part of the battlefield that many have argued have been loved to death. So we get about 1 million visitors annually, and most every one of them goes to Little Round Top. And over the years, of course, soil compaction, erosion has really damaged the resource. So Little Round Top is the latest example of a rehabilitation project. New trails were added, new interpretive paneling was added, and it is now accessible, fully accessible. So that's one example. We recently have rehabilitated the home of James Warfield, is an African American farm and farm family who lived along southern Seminary Ridge. James Warfield was one of about 200 African Americans who called Gettysburg home. So we were able to rehabilitate that structure to the 1863 footprint, to the way it would have appeared at the time of the fight, which allows us to tell a more full story of the battle. So we also just rehabilitated the Whistler House on the west of town, oftentimes called the first shot marker house because that's where the first shot of the Battle of Gettysburg took place. So it's ever going, it's ongoing. And again, our efforts are to preserve, maintain the land to its battle time appearance.
Okay, great. Now, follow up on the African American family. What was his name again?
James Warfield.
James Warfield. Now, they were here during the battle?
They left, yeah.
They left?
So most of Gettysburg's black community fled before the battle. They would flee their homes when word arrived in the community about Confederates in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
As the Confederate Army was moving through other Pennsylvania towns like Mercersburg and Chambersburg, black men, women, and children were being taken from their homes,
Right.
taken south into slavery. So most, but not all, of Gettysburg's black residents would flee their area before.
Okay. All right, great. That's a little piece that
Sure.
I didn't know. All right. If you can you briefly explain the historiography of the importance of Little Round Top and how it's changed for
Sure.
the last 161 years?
Well, it's interesting about Little Round Top because it's another example of how seemingly the smallest things could change the course of history. So what do I mean by that? Well, Little Round Top was owned by a gentleman named Ethan Hanaway before the war. And there's not much you could do with that land. It's steep, it's covered in rocks and boulders. And when Ethan Hanaway owned it, it was covered by trees, both the west and the eastern side of it. So he would kind of lease out his land up there for grazing for cattle farmers. And in 1858 or 1859, he decided to clear cut the western side of Little Round Top for timber, for wood. And by doing so, he exposed and opened that hillside. And during the Battle of Gettysburg, of course, because it was now open, it was clear that Little Round Top was an important position. So the Union Army, of course, recognized it. They had a signal station up there
Hmm.
from which they could communicate. They were able to detect Confederate movements up there. So from the start, that hilltop was seen as important. Um, and there's something about the natural beauty of the area that drew visitors there in the years following the fight. So, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, as the people of Gettysburg began to recover from this nightmare, a few of the local residents got together and they established the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, the GBMA. And they began to purchase acres of land from their neighbors who owned the fields on which this battle was fought. So,
Okay.
acre by acre, the Gettysburg battlefield was preserved. Now, to us, this is really nothing new, but in the 1860s, this was one of the first times a battlefield, as a place of such historic importance, is being purchased and preserved
Right.
for education. So Little Round Top would be among some of the acreage the
Hmm.
GBMA would purchase. But at first, it was Cemetery Hill. Cemetery Hill was the key spot on the battlefield. So this is the era before automobiles, when folks would arrive in town by railroad. Their hotels would be in town, and Cemetery Hill was really close to town. So you could walk there or just take a horse and
Right.
carriage up there. And of course, Cemetery Hill was central to the story of the battle, too.
Hmm.
It was key ground. Little Round Top was 2.5 miles away. To us today, that's a 2-minute drive, but in a horse and carriage, it was a bit further. So, yes, Little Round Top was always important. It was important during the battle, but it wasn't really until a railroad line and a trolley line was built literally across the battlefield that ended at Little Round Top.
Wow.
So there was at once in the 1880s, 1890s, and into the 1900s, there was a souvenir stand at Little Round Top.
Right. I saw that on
There
the
was a
map.
dance hall, a concession stand, and folks began to go there now that they had better access.
Hmm.
Automobiles came, and then in the 1970s, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Killer Angels, came out, and it made a central figure Joshua Chamberlain.
Yes.
Ever since that, and the movie that followed, Little Round Top has become the ground, the place where most every single visitor goes to here at Gettysburg,
Hmm.
and arguably the most famous spot on the battlefield.
Right.
And a lot of that was due to I guess, the cultural references to Chamberlain and that rocky hilltop in both the book and the movie that followed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the movie is Gettysburg.
Gettysburg,
Yeah.
1993. It was
Yeah.
also featured, I think Joshua Chamberlain was featured pretty heavily in the Ken
Yes.
Burns Civil
Yeah.
War
Hmm.
series. So,
Now, now was did they use any part of the battlefield for the movie? I know that's not one of the
yes,
questions.
there were some. The Little Round Top part, no.
Okay.
But some parts of it were filmed. I don't know exactly which ones. I'm thinking Devil's Den a little bit,
Hmm.
and I take that back. Not the battle sequence of Little Round Top, but the part that has the actor portraying Gouverneur Warren, I think, was filmed up there.
Okay.
Otherwise, it was filmed off location.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. All right. Thank you. All right. How important was John uh, Batchelder to the battlefield?
Sure, John Batchelder is an interesting fellow. He decided he's an artist, and he took up the study of Gettysburg soon after the battle. He was just
Hmm.
drawn to this story. So he traveled here and he began to interview people who fought here, North and South. And he is considered today widely to be Gettysburg's first historian.
Hmm.
And a lot of the history that he gathered were first person accounts from participants. And he created maps, several maps that depicted the terrain, the topography, and troop locations, which was key, which was critical. So John Batchelder certainly had a significant role in the creation of the battlefield and the memory of this battle as well. So John Batchelder also helped with the GBMA and the development of tour roads that
Hmm.
came in, monument placements, and especially with the construction of a narrative about Gettysburg. It was largely Batchelder who said this was the high watermark of the Confederacy, and the copse of trees as the central
Hmm.
location of Pickett's charge, even though we don't see any contemporary references to that in Lee's report or any other report.
Right.
But after the war, that it became such a focal point of the tourism and a compelling narrative, if you
Right.
will.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Sure.
And then, how did the myth, legend, or facts that it was General Warren
Hmm.
that saved the Union line at Little Round Top?
Sure. Now, sir, and General Warren certainly had a pivotal role in this. As chief engineer of the Army, he was asked by George Meade to attend to the matters on that hilltop down there. And when he arrived, he was kind of horrified to find that Little Round Top had been abandoned of troops. It was devoid of Union soldiers. There were some signal flag officers up there, and it was apparent to him that that hilltop be secured. So he at once went in motion. He began to dispatch aides, and he himself worked diligently to get soldiers to that hillside.
Mhm.
And we have to remember what happened to Warren after Gettysburg. He's elevated to Corps Command, but he never quite equaled his performance here. In fact, by the end of the war, he was uh, just dismissed on the battlefield by Philip Sheridan, and his career was ruined. And he worked hard to rescue his legacy, to beat the charges that Sheridan had levied against him just right at the end of the war. Um, so for Warren, Gettysburg became his moment. And for the soldiers who served under Warren, this was a place to memorialize him. So Warren became the savior of Little Round Top, and then conversely, or therefore, the savior of Gettysburg, and therefore the savior of the country. If Gettysburg was the turning point moment, if it was the battle, then Gouverneur Warren emerged after the war as the savior of it all. And I think Warren certainly appreciated that. He used that, especially as he was trying to rehabilitate his reputation, which was so badly damaged by Sheridan. Um, he wrote a letter to a soldier in the 140th New York that put him even more central to the story. So Gouverneur Warren, as he's fighting these charges after the war, he wrote a letter to a soldier in the 140th and said, it was me. I got to that hilltop and I directed an artillery battery to fire a cannon into the trees, and that's how I depicted the movement there. Well, that might not have been how it happened. And whether or not Warren ever wanted that to be out, to be known, to be published, the letter was published. And there was some pushback to that.
Mhm.
One of the signal flag officers said, no, we were well aware the Confederates were in the
Mhm.
distant tree line. And we had told Warren this when he first arrived on the hill. And he was disbelieving. He didn't believe it until a Confederate shell hit a nearby boulder, and either a part of the shell or a part of the rock hit his neck. And the signal flag officer looked at Warren and said, well, do you believe us now? That kind of thing. So that kind of has a little bit more of the, I don't want to say ring of truth to it,
Mhm.
than the whole, well, I had a cannon fired in that area. When the soldiers turned to look at the shell explosion, I caught the glint of the bayonet. I don't know.
Yeah, I that's one of the questions in here. Is an
Oh,
accurate account? And
right.
you already answered that. You know, and Abner Doubleday wrote about his experience at Gettysburg because
Sure.
he was here
Right.
as well,
Hmm.
and he mentioned it was General. I'm just confirming. He mentioned that it was General Warren that basically saved the left flank and saved the Union line.
Yeah, I mean, certainly his actions were pivotal, and it's a lot is in your interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, one of the more controversial figures here at Gettysburg is Daniel Sickles,
Correct.
and whether or not Daniel Sickles was supposed to hold Little Round Top with his left flank or just secure that area, is probably yes, but Sickles, by moving forward, he took all his soldiers away from there. Um, but we also do have to consider that maybe George Meade was not clear enough to Sickles. Maybe he did not take as active an interest in what was happening on his left flank. He was too hyper focused on Cemetery Hill. So without that leadership, Sickles took initiative
Right. Right.
that put the army in jeopardy,
Mm-hmm.
and all then led to Meade having to respond and react. But Gouverneur Warren got to Little Round Top, and by some of his quick actions, he was able to get soldiers there
Right, right.
quickly.
Yeah. Now
So
you kind of answered question number, well, it's 10, but did Dan Sickles moving his troops away from Little Drop and to defeat George to compromise Little Round Top? And
yeah,
you
and I think,
basically answered
when you
that.
stand on Little Round Top, the first thought is, well, it's high ground. Of course, it's key. If the Confederates had gotten cannons up here, yeah, true. But also the importance of Little Round Top is its proximity to the Union supply lines and also to the Town Road, which
Right,
is, it's immediately it runs up next to the road.
right,
And the
right.
Town Road was one of the two avenues of supply, reinforcement, and escape for the Union Army. So if the Confederates had gotten astride that road, if they were able to put cannons up on that elevated position, perhaps they could have turned the rest of the Union line.
Mhm.
But it's a lot of what ifs. A lot of what
Correct.
ifs.
Yes. Right. And then back to General Warren. A more recent historian, Alan Guzlo,
hmm
he had basically said it wasn't the explosions that reflected off of the bayonets.
Yeah.
He said it was the sunlight because it was
Yeah.
sunny at that
Right.
moment, and
Yeah.
that's probably what he saw as compared
Yeah,
to
yeah.
you know.
Now, I don't think it was Warren who discovered the Confederates.
Mhm.
I think that their presence was probably known to the signal flag. There was a handful of signal flag officers up there all day, and they were paying close attention to what the Confederates were doing.
Okay.
And also, too, Dan Sickles. Say what you will, he did correctly predict that Lee would focus his efforts against the Union left.
Mm,
And when Dan Sickles sent soldiers into Pitzer's Woods, the sharpshooters, the 3rd Maine, they do encounter Confederates in those woods. So the presence of Confederates building against the left flank was probably not something discovered by Warren, but something that Warren responded
yes, and he
to.
also lived long enough to write
He sure
what he
did.
wanted.
Yes, yeah, and that is key in the creation of memory.
Right,
Who lives and who
right.
tells the story.
Exactly, because I know the first era of historiography of Gettysburg,
Yes.
it's basically everything. You had some historians. Yeah, you had Backelder doing his stuff. You had a couple of the other ones, but then you have the writings of Abner Doubleday,
Right.
Gouverneur Warren,
hmm
even Joseph Chamberlain had his
Yes.
own, and of course the official reports
Right.
that they created.
Yes.
They're not going to make it look like, well, I did a bad job
Right.
here.
Well, I mean, Dan Sickles went to his grave believing he had saved the country here,
Right?
and some still believe that today.
Yeah, and he
So
used his leg as a
he did.
to
And
save
and when we
himself.
look at the accounts of these, I mean, you have to look at their angle,
Hmm.
who they're writing it for, and for what purpose. Did they want this to be published? Did they not? Abner Doubleday was relieved of his command here for whatever reason. George Meade didn't like him,
Right.
so Doubleday had a bit of a axe to grind
Correct.
here against Meade, and so did Dan Sickles. And some of the first reports of the Battle of Gettysburg that Abraham Lincoln received were from the mouth of Dan Sickles. So it didn't reflect well on Meade, certainly. So even though they are first person accounts, we always have to look at those sources critically.
Right.
Who's saying it? Why?
Right. All right. One more question on Gouverneur Warren. The spot where his monument is, and the placard that's on the rock,
Mhm.
is that, as far as we could tell or have researched, that's where he stood, or is
As far as we can tell, I mean, it's one of those things where I believe it was veterans of his first regiment, the Fifth New York, who kind
Mhm.
of placed that.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know if any of them were with Warren when he did that.
Right.
I would imagine that Warren probably hopped from rock to rock to rock up there,
Yeah.
looking for a good observation post, and maybe he stayed there momentarily.
Mhm.
We don't know if he picked one rock and stood there,
Right.
or I would imagine he was an energetic man. He was. I don't know if he would just find one station and stick with it.
Right.
But it is a compelling statue. It's unique, almost unique in that it's right on the ground. It doesn't stand on top of a pedestal or
Hmm.
monument. Um, so it's there's a term for that in the art world, but it escapes me now. So I mean, most likely at some point probably stood there,
Yeah.
but he probably also stood here and there, and
Right. Right.
moved around.
Yeah, and it's like nobody thought in November to mark the spot where Lincoln
Right.
made his address that
Yes.
basically, made put him on the map,
Right.
really.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And Gettysburg, really. All right. Why do you think the 20th Maine, particularly with Joseph Chamberlain, is more popular, more famous than like the 140th New
hmm
York, and who did just as much
Right.
fighting and did it?
hmm
I mean, they had to deal with the Alabamans just as
Right.
well as Chamberlain.
Absolutely right. It's an interesting question. Why do we remember some units? Why do we remember some people more than others? Joshua Chamberlain is a big reason why. He wrote extensively after the war. He gave lectures extensively after the war. And um, the fact that the 20th Maine was at the very end of the Union line of battle, the drama of the moment, the bayonet charge captures imagination. And Chamberlain knew that, and he spoke about it often. Unfortunately, the commander of the 140th is killed up there, Patrick O'Rourke.
Correct.
Brigade Commander Strong Vincent is mortally injured up there.
Hmm.
James Rice, who took command after Vincent, is killed the following year at Spotsylvania. And the commander of the 16th Maine is killed at 16th Michigan, also in that same brigade, is killed at Petersburg. So Chamberlain is badly wounded also, but he survives, and he seems to be kind of the leading, most prominent voice from that fight who survived.
Right.
So a lot of history is written not by the victors, but by the people who survived it.
Correct. Correct. Yeah.
So I think that's one of the big reasons why, and certainly when Michael Shara and Ron Maxwell in the book and then the movie chose to make Chamberlain such a pivotal figure, um, that also elevated their story beyond all the other units nearby.
Great. Thank you. Why do you think at the 100th anniversary of the battle, the it just kind of like rekindled the interest in Gettysburg?
Yeah.
And I mean, you figure 100 years, 63, you know, Kennedy wasn't
hmm
murdered yet, but,
Right.
we're
hmm
going through some tough times in the country. But
Right.
why is it 100th anniversary? Gettysburg is becoming more popular again.
Yeah, yeah, and the centennial of the war overall, 1961 to 1965, so going along with the height of the civil rights movement, um, I think some of it had to do with that, the unrest in the country, looking for this fantasy of reconciliation and all that, and the myth of the olden days and all that. Maybe that had something to do with it. Um, but we just had the 80th anniversary of D-Day,
Correct.
so there was a lot of renewed interest
Correct.
at that time.
Yes, I was
Yeah,
watching a lot of those videos.
absolutely. So I think it's in America's. I don't want to call it psyche. It is an American thing, and worldwide too. But to commemorate significant times. I was just, we are preparing for the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord, and then the
Right.
2026 250th birthday of the United
Hmm.
States. So maybe it was the 100th anniversary, post World War II. Uh, Post Eisenhower, of course, who lived here at Gettysburg,
True.
that might have driven some interest in that as well. But yeah, there was pronounced, and we just lost America's last surviving Civil War soldier in 1956.
Okay.
So at that point, the Civil War was there was no living
Correct. Yeah.
witness to the
Yeah.
war. So that's a good question, and there have been some historians who have studied that. Unfortunately, I'm not as well versed in that. hmm
Yeah, I know when you mentioned the 80th anniversary of D-Day, I mean, there was quite a few guys, not a lot, a handful
Yes,
of guys that landed
yes,
that day that
yeah,
were there
it's
and back.
remarkable.
And I'm watching these things and watching these guys, and I'm just like almost in tears
Right,
because it's like
yeah,
they were children.
right.
And now they're at the end stages of their life, and here they are, over close to 100, if not over,
Right.
going back for the
And
first
and
time.
Gettysburg witnessed something like that in 1938,
Yeah, but it's
the
75th.
75th.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah,
there were, a good handful of veterans still,
right.
90 plus, 100 plus.
Wow.
So I couldn't help but think back to that when I watched the 80th commemorations.
Right. Yeah, I've seen a lot of the pictures of the
hmm
75th Yeah,
Yeah.
because of course with social media, Facebook, I'm on the Gettysburg, one or two of their different
Right.
sites, and
Hmm.
yeah, there's always pictures flashing of at the high water mark. Yeah, Confederates one side, Union soldiers on shaking hands.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. All right. Great. This might be a tough one, but yeah, do you happen to know how many books, journals, magazines in total have been written about Gettysburg?
Well, I mean, it's in terms of books, articles. I mean, it's well into the hundreds, many hundreds. It seems like every aspect of the battle has been written about, but there's no end to the interest people have.
Right.
If people weren't interested, the books wouldn't be published, you
Correct.
know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I could go back in our library collection now and find, I mean, scores of books written about Cutler's Brigade at Gettysburg, Daniel's Brigade at Gettysburg, Rhodes' Division at Gettysburg,
Mhm.
Pickett's Division at Gettysburg, the fight in the wheat field, the fight in the peach orchard, the fight, on Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill. Some are overviews, they're campaign studies. Some are minute, detailed focus studies on the fighting at Devil's Den. Some focus specifically on one commander at Gettysburg. So I would estimate that there have been hundreds of books and articles published pertaining to this 3 day battle and its aftermath. Increasingly, we are seeing an interest in the field hospitals, the
Mhm.
doctors, the nurses, the treatment of the wounded, what happened to these soldiers after their wound, their injury, what happened to the town after the fight.
Right.
And increasingly, we're seeing a focus on battlefield preservation. So
Correct.
there have been a number of monographs and studies and dissertations about preservation efforts over the years. So there is really no end to the interest people have in this 3 day battle in 1863.
That yeah, it's not like a simple, um, like a Brandywine. Brandywine was like a two area, maybe three Battle of
Mhm.
Brandywine for Revolution. Whereas Gettysburg, you have by the college,
Right.
seminary,
Oh, yes.
Cemetery Ridge.
Yeah.
You have all over the place. They're just
Hmm.
troops everywhere and fighting everywhere,
Absolutely.
and it's like one I saw one of the maps that Backelder
Hmm.
had drawn up of troop placements on July 2nd through the whole
The
area,
day. Right.
and
Yeah.
and then how they moved on the third, and it's just all you see a bunch of red on the one side, a bunch of blue, and you can't read the units, but when you look at it, because you don't think of you see the movie or you got well they had 300 guys here or 1,300 men, but then when you actually see it on the map and where they were,
Right.
you know
As the battle progressed.
it's just
Hmm.
unbelievable.
And also, too, will be remiss not to mention Abraham Lincoln
Mhm.
and his association with Gettysburg. So
Yes,
there have been dozens of books written about his 272-word speech.
correct.
And the number one question I get on a daily basis is not about the battle. It's where did Lincoln stand? They want
Exactly
to know where
right.
Lincoln stood, where he gave the address. So not only the fight, but also the memory of it. In beginning, you could argue with Lincoln and how he memorialized the soldiers and the
Correct.
battle here.
Correct.
Hmm.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Um, I did any of the surviving generals ever visit, come back?
Hmm. Yeah, they did. Interestingly enough, one of the first was in 1865.
Okay.
Oliver Howard gave a speech at the laying of the cornerstone of the Soldiers' Monument in the
Okay.
National Cemetery.
Okay.
I think other generals were with him. John Geary came back in 1867 as governor of Pennsylvania, and he
Okay.
had as a guest Ulysses Grant.
Oh, great.
Um, James Longstreet was back with Dan Sickles touring the battlefield in the 1890s, and there's actually photographs of them together up on Little Round Top and elsewhere on the
Wow.
battlefield. So
Wow.
yeah, there were a number of generals who did come back.
Yeah.
Meade came back in 1869 to dedicate the Soldiers Monument once it was completed.
Wow.
So,
That's
mhm.
great. Thank you. Do you happen to know any of the historians or the writers of Gettysburg that wrote the story of the battle without a lot of sensationalization?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say if you want to get those accounts without the sensationalism, look for the ones that were never intended to be published. We're looking at the soldiers' letters home,
Hmm.
um, that kind of thing. There are some official reports that seem more genuine without the lofty praise and all of that. Um, one of the more famous accounts is Frank Haskell's letter that he wrote after the battle, which is published in book form. It was so lengthy. But that's a really quotable account. So there's sensationalism uh, just about anywhere. And, easy for me to say I wasn't here, of course.
Correct.
But I would say look for those letters that were intended for mom or dad
Okay.
or wife or children. The ones that talk about on the Confederate side, you know, taking a licking, getting whipped on the field. And
Correct.
you won't oftentimes see that in any published accounts.
Correct. Yeah.
On the Union side, sometimes the newspaper accounts. Frank Wilkeson was a correspondent with the New York Tribune, I think. It could be another newspaper. His son is killed here. So he was what we today would call an embedded journalist and traveling with the Union Army. He arrived on the battlefield, I think, July 2nd, and his son had been killed the day before.
Oh, wow.
And when he discovered that, he wrote from the Gettysburg battlefield to report on the battle, but as a grieving father who laid to rest the remains of his son.
Wow.
And, so that's kind of a real, account, if you
Right.
will,
Yeah.
stripped away of the
Okay.
lofty language.
Right. Right. Yeah, I read years ago. I had gotten a book on the Civil War, and it was from start to finish, but written. It was all by letters
Right.
of soldiers writing home to their wives. They said, "Father,"
Yeah.
and it gave you a whole different outlook because it wasn't just all Union.
Yeah.
Because from the North,
Mhm.
whose side of the story you're going to get?
Mhm.
The North side.
Mhm.
But this book included Southern soldiers
Yeah.
that they were writing home. It's obviously in the early parts of the war, it was going great for them, and then they started running out of supplies, food, and well, then after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, it was very difficult to
Yeah.
continue on fighting.
I mean, there are a number of secondary sources that address some of the myths of Gettysburg. Um, Thomas Desjardins' These Honored Dead is one example.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they try to remove the layers of memory. We try to
Correct.
remove those layers of nostalgia and
Right.
get to kind of the real. Cornelia Hancock was a nurse who came here, and she wrote about being a nurse, a volunteer nurse at the field hospitals. Um, that too, is kind of a real raw look.
Okay.
The doctor's accounts that describe operations. We have a soldier who was mortally injured here. He was wounded July 3rd. He passed away in August. But a nurse who was attending to him at the seminary wrote a letter to his family right after his death, and it's heartbreaking.
Oh, wow.
You get the real.
Mm-hmm.
I was with your brother when he breathed his last, and I have seen this so often. My heart just grieves and aches for you. So I would say those kind of accounts is where you're going to get really the unvarnished, not really sensationalized
Okay.
look at
Great.
it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And the last question, which deals with the movie Gettysburg and its focus on Little Round Top, did it add to the mystique that Little Round Top was key to the Union line? And as historian Jacob Hook stated, destiny of the government depended on its occupation?
Yeah, I think it did. I really think it did. There's a good number of visitors we get. Not so much anymore. But when I first began here, the movie was then only 20 years old and not 30 years plus as it is now. Um, I would hear oftentimes from visitors, this was the key ground. This was where the Union was saved, that kind of thing. What the Confederates would have been able to do had they theoretically turned Chamberlain's flank with 600 men from Alabama. The entire Union Sixth Corps has arrived on the field. I think oftentimes we dismiss the idea that the Union Army would have fought to get it back,
Right.
So I would imagine they probably would have.
Right.
And what they would have been able to do so far stretched out, unsupported, you could argue that it was an important position. But if you're a soldier fighting on Cemetery Ridge, this is the important position. If you're on Culp's Hill, this is the important position. I mean, if the Confederate Army had gotten to Culp's Hill, if Little Round Top was saved, if for whatever reason Culp's Hill fell, well, the Union line is turned there too, and the Baltimore Pike is compromised.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, the movie because of its centrality with Chamberlain, I think added to the, as you said, mystique
Okay.
about the importance of Little Round Top.
And then basically, do you think the movie covered a lot of what happened here accurately? I mean, besides you take away the sensationalism of,
Right.
but I mean, is it
Yeah.
relatively accurate?
I mean, as you could argue, I mean, there's a lot of folks were disappointed in that it didn't cover anything of the Culp's Hill fight. It didn't really focus much on this action or that action. But on the other hand, it was a 4 hour long movie to begin with.
Correct.
I mean, you can't really make a movie. I mean, it was a movie. It wasn't a documentary.
Hmm.
There were some things that got right. There were some things, well, maybe not so right. But
Right.
still, uh, it generated interest, and it
Great.
got people here, and it got people um, committed to preserving this, and it got people a Little Round Top, and we had to recently rehabilitate the landscape up there.
Correct.
So,
Correct.
um, you could argue about the importance of just about anywhere on the field, as you could argue about the importance of seemingly smaller engagements. But Gettysburg seems to be central to our understanding of the war.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
One more. It's not even,
Sure.
but has there been anything that you've ever questioned and you still have not found an answer?
About the Battle of Gettysburg?
Yeah, but
Oh.
it could be something simple or something, you know.
It is somewhat tricky, and this is getting down in the weeds a little bit to establish what John Reynolds was intending to do with the Union here on the first day. We know that John Buford, the cavalry commander, had put his men west and north of town.
Mhm.
He wrote to John Reynolds about doing so, and Reynolds marched to his assistance. But whether or not Reynolds, committed to the fight here, if he contributed to the building of the fight here, or wanted to fight at Gettysburg, well, he was killed. So really, his intentions is something that I don't think we'll ever know.
Right.
Because he
Right.
was killed shortly after he began to position his men. So if he had more time to consider the landscape, the terrain, the situation, would he have committed his First Corps? Would the 11th Corps have been committed after that? Or would they have ultimately been notified of George Meade's plan to fall back to Pipe Creek in Maryland? So maybe that's something, but that's getting down in the weeds a little bit. Um, that's a good question. Unfortunately, nothing really popped into mind.
That's okay. All right. Great. Well, again, thank you for your time.
You're very welcome, George. Thank you.